The morning everything changed did not feel dramatic at first, and that was what made it so unsettling, because nothing about the sky, the temperature, or the sounds of the town suggested that my entire life was about to be stripped down to its bones. I had just turned 57 a few weeks earlier, and for more than 3 decades I had built my waste management excavation company from nothing but rusted tools and stubborn will, turning it into the most reliable operation in 3 counties around the quiet manufacturing town of Ashridge, Indiana. People used to joke that I made my fortune cleaning up everyone else's mess, but they never realized how painfully true that statement would become. I had just reviewed a profitable quarter with my accountant, seeing numbers that confirmed I could finally slow down, maybe even retire early, when I heard my wife's car pull into the gravel drive earlier than expected. Her voice drifted through the house with that carefully controlled calm that meant something had already been decided without me. She told me our daughter had chosen another man to walk her down the aisle, someone who had become important to the family. And when she said his name, my chest felt hollow, as if all the air had been drained out of me at once. It was my former business partner, the man who once stood beside me while we built our first contracts, the same man who had slowly crept into my home, my marriage, and my daughter's loyalty while I was busy working 12-hour days. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam doors. I simply nodded, returned to my office, and stared at the wedding spreadsheet still open on my screen, where nearly $50,000 of my labor was allocated to a celebration I was no longer welcome to participate in. For years, I had convinced myself that stability was worth enduring emotional distance, that loyalty meant tolerating silence and suspicion, as long as everyone stayed under one roof. But the moment I realized my daughter had replaced me in her most meaningful moment, something inside me finally collapsed. I remembered teaching her to ride a bike, watching her perform in school plays, working overtime to pay for her college tuition, and now I was being quietly erased from her life in favor of a man who had betrayed me in every way possible. I began calling each vendor calmly, methodically, as if I were canceling a construction project rather than dismantling my own family's future. The venue coordinator sounded shocked. The caterer asked if there had been a mistake. The florist pleaded, but I remained professional and unemotional, withdrawing every payment and stopping every transfer until the wedding account was empty again. The money I had earned through sweat and sacrifice returned to my business savings in minutes, leaving behind nothing but confusion and panic for those who had assumed I would quietly accept being discarded. When my wife confronted me, calling my actions immature and cruel, I looked at her and realized I no longer recognized the woman standing before me. I told her calmly that if the man she had chosen was now playing father of the bride, he could also assume the financial responsibility that came with the role. And then I closed the door, knowing the life I had known was already over. That evening, alone in my workshop surrounded by decades of tools and faded photographs, I finally allowed myself to feel the weight of what had been taken from me. There was an old picture of my daughter sitting proudly in the cab of one of my first excavators, wearing a helmet too large for her small head, telling anyone who would listen that her dad could move mountains. Another showed my former partner and me shaking hands after landing our first commercial contract, unaware that years later he would be the one digging the deepest wound of all. I found the paperwork from when I had bought him out of the company, paying him a small fortune to walk away, believing we were parting as friends. Tucked behind those documents was the deed to a small lakeside cabin I had purchased secretly the year before, a quiet retreat in Kentucky meant as a safety net if everything ever collapsed. Standing there, I understood I had been preparing for this moment long before I was willing to admit it. When my daughter arrived later that night, pleading for understanding and insisting that her choice was complicated, I listened without interruption. She spoke of how he had been supportive when I seemed distant, how he felt like family now, and how her mother's happiness mattered. I asked her gently when loyalty had become optional, when betrayal had become acceptable, and she had no answer. When I told her the wedding was no longer funded, her shock felt small compared to the years of quiet dismissal I had endured. By sunrise, the entire town was buzzing, because in a place with fewer than 10,000 residents, secrets traveled faster than sound. Calls came from vendors, from friends, from relatives, each trying to convince me to reverse my decision, but none could offer a reason that made sense anymore. Even my former partner phoned, claiming it had all just happened, begging me not to punish my daughter for adult mistakes, but his words rang hollow after years of deception. I reminded him that betrayal was not an accident, that he had knowingly stepped into my home, my marriage, and my child's trust, and that no apology could rewrite that truth. Then I turned off my phone and drove for hours until the familiar streets of Ashridge disappeared behind me, replaced by winding rural roads leading to the quiet cabin that would become my refuge. The lake was still, the air clean, and for the first time in months, my chest felt light. I fished until dusk, cooked my meal over an open flame, and slept without listening for footsteps or whispered conversations, realizing that solitude felt far safer than the company I had lost. When I returned days later, my attorney informed me that my former partner was attempting to purchase my company with outside investors, convinced I was desperate to sell. The irony made me laugh, because I had never felt more in control of my future. I countered with a firm price and strict terms, knowing he would accept out of sheer pride and fear of appearing weak. When the deal was finalized, I walked away with a fortune and no obligations, leaving him with a business he did not truly understand and investors who would show no mercy when profits fell short. Watching him sign the papers, his hands shaking, I felt neither triumph nor anger, only the quiet certainty that life had finally balanced its scales. I packed my office into a few boxes, drove back to the lake, and began building a new routine that revolved around peace rather than constant compromise. Months passed, and the chaos back home slowly resolved itself through consequences I never had to orchestrate. The wedding was canceled. The relationship unraveled, and the business collapsed under poor management and mounting debts. My daughter eventually visited, her voice softer, her eyes filled with regret, admitting that she had misunderstood loyalty and confused convenience with love. We spoke honestly for the first time in years, and while the wounds remained, they no longer defined us. I learned that sometimes walking away is not abandonment but self-preservation, and that freedom is not found in revenge, but in choosing yourself after years of neglect. Sitting by the water at sunset, listening to the quiet hum of the wind, I realized that losing everything had finally allowed me to gain something far more valuable than money or approval. I had found peace, and for the first time in decades, that was enough. The first time I truly understood that my life had been divided into a before, and an after was not during the arguments, not when the newspapers ran their sensational headlines, and not even when the last box from my old office was unloaded into the cabin, but during a quiet morning when I stood barefoot on the wooden dock, coffee cooling in my hand, watching fog drift lazily across the surface of the lake, as if the world itself had decided to move on without me. In that silence, I realized how long I had lived for everyone else's expectations, bending myself into shapes that made others comfortable while slowly erasing my own needs. Every memory of my former life arrived in fragments. Late nights repairing machinery while my family slept, missed birthdays excused as temporary sacrifices. The subtle emotional distance that crept in until I felt like a guest in my own home. It was painful to accept that I had contributed to the collapse by prioritizing stability over connection, yet that realization brought clarity rather than shame. For the first time, I was no longer reacting to betrayal or defending my pride. I was rebuilding myself from the ground up, learning how to live without measuring my worth by how much I provided. The lake became my witness to this transformation, reflecting not just the sky above, but the quiet resolve growing inside me. News from Ashridge still reached me, carried by old friends who called to share updates about the fallout. They told me how my former partner struggled to manage the company, how regulatory issues piled up, how equipment was repossessed when payments were missed, and how his investors turned cold the moment profits declined. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a distant sense of inevitability, as if the collapse were simply the natural conclusion of choices made long before I ever withdrew my support. My ex-wife, they said, had moved away to stay with relatives, claiming she needed a fresh start, yet everyone knew she was escaping the consequences she refused to face. The house I once maintained was sold, my name removed from it as thoroughly as my presence had been removed from my family's plans. Still, I did not feel homeless. The cabin, modest and weathered, held more warmth and authenticity than any place I had lived before, because it was chosen not as a compromise, but as an affirmation of my right to exist for myself. My daughter's visits became more frequent, each one marked by long conversations, shared meals, and slow, careful attempts to rebuild trust. She spoke of regret, of realizing too late that admiration for someone who offered temporary comfort had blinded her to the unwavering support she had taken for granted. I listened without judgment, knowing that pain loses its power when it is finally acknowledged. We fished together, repaired the dock, and laughed in ways we hadn't for years, rediscovering pieces of our bond that had been buried under resentment and misunderstanding. I never promised that things would return to how they once were, because we both understood that the past could not be restored, but we allowed space for something new to grow, something based on honesty rather than obligation. Watching her learn from her mistakes reminded me that healing is not about erasing scars, but about letting them teach us where we went wrong. As seasons changed, I found purpose in simplicity. I planted a small garden, repaired the roof, volunteered occasionally at a local community center, and learned to appreciate quiet mornings without deadlines or demands. Money, once the central measure of my success, became merely a tool rather than a source of identity. I invested wisely, ensuring that my future would be secure without requiring constant labor, and I discovered how little I truly needed to feel content. The absence of constant stress felt unfamiliar at first, but gradually it became the foundation of my new life. Each day unfolded without expectation, and that freedom felt more luxurious than any house or title I had ever owned. When strangers occasionally recognized my name from the story that had once circulated, they often expressed admiration, calling me brave or resolute, but I no longer felt defined by their opinions. Their praise and curiosity belonged to a version of me that had already faded, a man forged in conflict and public scrutiny. The person I was becoming existed quietly, beyond headlines and gossip, shaped by self-awareness and resilience rather than reaction. I learned that true strength is not found in proving others wrong, but in choosing a life that aligns with your values, even when no one is watching. One evening, as my daughter and I shared dinner under a sky streaked with purple and gold, she told me she had met someone kind, someone who valued honesty and respect, and I saw hope return to her eyes. In that moment, I felt a sense of peace deeper than any victory could offer, because her happiness no longer depended on correcting the past, but on building a healthier future. I realized that love does not end when relationships fail. It simply changes form, growing quieter but no less meaningful. Time continued its steady march forward, carrying with it the certainty that change is the only constant. I no longer feared solitude, because it had taught me who I was when no one else demanded anything from me. I no longer feared loss because I had learned that letting go sometimes creates space for something better. Standing by the lake watching ripples fade into stillness, I understood that freedom is not found in escape, but in acceptance. Acceptance of what was, what is, and what can still be. I had lost a marriage, a business, and the version of myself that believed sacrifice was synonymous with love, yet I gained something far more enduring: clarity, peace, and the courage to live honestly. My life no longer revolved around fixing other people's problems or proving my worth through endurance. It revolved around quiet mornings, meaningful conversations, and the simple joy of knowing that I was finally living on my own terms. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the water, I felt gratitude for every lesson that had brought me here, even the painful ones. They had stripped away illusions and forced me to confront who I truly was beneath years of compromise. And in that reflection, I found not bitterness, but hope, a belief that no matter how deeply life fractures us, there is always a path forward if we are brave enough to walk it. The lake grew dark, the stars emerging one by one, and I realized that for the first time in decades, I was not waiting for anything else to happen. I was content with where I stood, anchored not by fear or regret, but by a quiet confidence that whatever tomorrow held, I would face it with honesty, strength, and the hard-earned peace of a man who finally chose himself.